Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. First, I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists for agreeing to join us for today's webinar. I would also like to thank you all for joining us for this interesting panel. This webinar is organized by the Centers of International Business Education at Michigan State and Texas A&M Universities as part of our Research Spotlight series. The topic of today's webinar is opportunities in international sales research, tips and trends. For this webinar, we invited 3 marketing scholars who have recently published important foundational work for the future of international marketing scholarship in the field of personal selling and sales management. Our panelists will discuss their research addressing contemporary conceptual and methodological best practices. This webinar will include short presentations followed by a discussion moderated by the co-hosts. David and I will be your co-hosts today. I'm Ahmet Kirca. I'm an associate professor of international business and marketing at Michigan State University Broad College. I also serve as the director of the International Business Center, MSU Cyber at MSU. David is the Holly Vanderheider Chair in Business, Professor of Marketing and Associate Director of Research at the Center for International Business Studies at Texas A&M University. We have 3 international marketing scholars who have recently published important work on various international sales topics. First, we're going to start with Dr. Nathan Hartman. He's an assistant professor in the School of Marketing and Innovation and serves as a senior researcher for the newly created Marketing and Sales Innovation Center. Much of Nathan's research focuses on improving sales force effectiveness. His research has appeared in the Journal of Marketing, Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science, Journal of Service Research, JPIM, and Journal of Personal Selling and Sales Management, among others. Our second panelist will be Dr. Wyatt Schrock. He is an assistant professor of marketing at Michigan State University. He was previously an assistant professor of marketing at West Virginia University, and his research interest includes salesperson motivation, sales manager leadership, persuasion, and brand management. His research has been published in Marketing Letters, in the Journal of Personal Selling and Sales Management, and the Journal of the Academy of Marketing Science. And our third panelist will be Dr. Jessica Ogilvie, and she's an assistant professor of marketing in the College of Business Administration at Marquette University, where she teaches marketing and professional selling courses. Jessica has published research in multiple peer-reviewed journals, including Journal of Marketing, Journal of Retailing, Journal of Service Research, Industrial Marketing Management, and Journal of Personal Selling and Sales Management. Before we start our discussion with Nathan, I would like to mention that we would appreciate if you could write your questions to David and send them to us via the chat function. David and I will monitor the chat box closely and group them and pose the questions to the panelists. Enjoy the discussion.
Nathan, take it away.
All right, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for taking the time to listen to me. And what I want to talk about very briefly is theory, the importance of doing more theory, and then transition to some recent integrations that I and others have made to the sales literature with respect to theory, and then focus really more in on what I think is the best context for a presentation like this. And that's how it is that we can implement some of these theoretical advancements with research in the sales domain. And so the first thing that I want to communicate is that there's still a huge need to do theoretical work right now in sales. If you think about how it is that our journals are progressing, it's becoming more and more methodologically sophisticated, but we're still really relying an awful lot on the theory that's been developed in other domains. And a problem of that is that the novelty in our journals, in my opinion, is lacking to some degree. And I think that we could have a much bigger impact in the broader marketing discipline, but also in management, if we're able to more effectively make theoretical contributions. And so that's really where my focus has been over the last couple of years. And I'm trying to encourage more people to jump on board with that. And I think a big part of the reason why you should consider really focusing more on theory if you're not already is it's a great venue to get cited. You can publish while doing it, and you don't necessarily need as rich of data because your contributions are primarily theoretical. And as a result, editors and reviewers may give you a little bit more leeway within the review process. But the most important thing that I really want to emphasize about this is that it allows you to introduce generalizable insights that span beyond a specific context. And I think one of the things that recent research is pointing to is the fact that we're seeing a lot of context-driven effects. And so with this foundation laid, I want to argue that we're seeing a real great time to start doing this theoretical work in cells, because we're seeing a greater consensus on the fact that the cells process is nonlinear in nature, that it involves many actors. And also there's a broadening and blurring of not only cells in service, but other tasks within the cells area, but also in other areas, right? So it's increasingly common for people in engineering, marketing, and finance to have some type of interaction with people in the buying organization. And as that happens, they're increasingly taking on some selling tasks. And I think that there's been a really awesome paper. Jess was a co-author of that paper that was published in JPSSM recently that talks about the need to look at effects over different contexts, including countries, firms, and methods and times. Because by doing so, we're able to tease out a lot richer insights than we otherwise would. And this type of thinking, it extends what we've been doing. If we think about salespeople and we think about selling, it's traditionally been about persuasion and influence, and salespeople as knowledge providers and advisors, and buyers as communicators and needs and wants. But we're seeing an increasing recognition, and also a change to some degree too, with the emergence of technologies like the internet and the prevalence of it and so on, that salespeople have limited ability to change the thinking and the actions of buyers. A lot of the times those buyers are guided by clear criteria that informs how it is that they should be evaluating solutions. And they're also drawing on many sources of information and knowledge, the salesperson just being one of those. Another thing that we're pointing to the importance of is at least considering institutions. And we've always looked at institutions and sales, institutions just being things like norms and values and beliefs and routine ways of behaviors. But what we're arguing for is the importance of looking at this, I would say, in a way that's maybe a little bit more direct and focal to the research questions, and then also trying to recognize more some of the many actors that are involved in selling. Now, recently within the JPSSM editorial we've done for a special issue, what we pointed to is the importance of context and recognizing context. And I think that this is a real big opportunity for international research within this area. And that's because we can better understand what happens between the salesperson and the buyer by looking at different levels of context. We think about that relationship between a salesperson and buyer. It's taking place in a context between a selling organization and a buying organization. And oftentimes people in both of those organizations are interacting with one another. You've got reputational effects that are going both ways. And so by better understanding what's taking place between those organizations, we can better understand the effectiveness of various salesperson behaviors, knowledge, skills, and abilities. But it's also important to recognize that this selling is taking place within industries. And industries are inherently different from one another. They have different growth rates, they have different institutions, and all of those things can influence the effectiveness of what it is that a salesperson does, as well as the knowledge, skills, and abilities. And of course, we can take that to a higher level of aggregation, and we can look at what goes on in a society, right? We can look at the laws, we can look at the regulations, we can look at what's accepted or unaccepted in a particular area. And that will also inform what is going to be effective or ineffective within a salesperson and buyer. And so what we're pointing to is the importance of a deeper dive into some of these areas to, again, better understand that salesperson buyer relationship. And what this does is lead me to introduce what I think are 5 emerging opportunities that are really well suited for the international marketing research area. And I'm going to talk about each one of these to a little bit of depth. And the first of these is just going to be looking at discrete to aggregate outcomes. And if we think about aggregated outcomes, they're essentially just summations of discrete outcomes. Right? And there might be a tendency as a result to presume that the effects, both the direction and the size of the effect, is going to be consistent between that discrete versus more aggregate outcome. So as an example of that, I think about salesperson's unethical behavior. Why does it happen? Well, it probably happens in some ways because it does help improve their performance, at least in the short term. But over the long term, there's probably negative consequences of that. If we look at ourselves to only saying that this is the time period that we're going to examine it within, then we get a sort of biased skew, a biased assessment of what's actually going on. The other way that I want to bring this up is looking at information. And so we know today that customers are often more informed or as informed as a salesperson about the thing that they're purchasing, the problem that they have, as well as the margins in some cases that the seller might be making. And so there's been some arguments that we should be sharing information. Salespeople should be sharing information with customers on the front end of the deal to try to exploit trust on the back end of the deal. And if we do that, salespeople, then greater sales and profit is going to come at the short term. And that may be absolutely the case. But the problem comes is what happens when customers find out about that tactic, right? Do they become more skeptical? And as a result, does the effectiveness and the relationship become even more eroded between the customer and the salesperson? And so by broadening what it is that we're examining, I think we get a richer perspective of what might be going on. The other opportunity I wanted to introduce was the relationship between repeated events and critical events. And I think that this is something that we've not looked at all in the sales area, but it's a real rich opportunity. These critical events are often the outcome of many minor events. And we could think about the interactions between a salesperson and a buyer to the buyer's decision to purchase. And so, one of the questions that raises is, are interactions in earlier or later steps of the buying process more important to the purchase decision? If so, then it informs where it is that salespeople should be allocating their most preparation. Also, we could think about what salesperson characteristics or behaviors change in importance throughout the selling process, right? That also lets us know as to what it is that salespeople should be doing, and also how it is that we should be coaching them, things of that nature. And then also when and how to integrate the efforts of other people within the selling process. All of these things offer different insights. And the last point I want to make about this is we could even take this down to a specific interaction, right? So we could look at it, just as a buyer-seller interaction, one period in time, and as a salesperson making a series of persuasion attempts to the buyer. And what we've not looked at, but I think we should, is how it is that these influence tactics build off of one another. Arguably, their effectiveness and their importance depends on the influence tactics that were made before it. So for example, collaboration is an influence tactic, may be effective, but it might only be effective after rational persuasion and consultation has been attempted. The third thing that I'd like to introduce, and I think that this is a really great opportunity for international marketing research, is exploring as opposed to controlling for context. And what I'm pointing to here is bringing context to the foreground. And I think one of the big mistakes that we make in sales is that we compare and contrast generalities. Like we say B2B versus B2C. And I think what we should be looking at is the meaningful institutions that change between B2B versus B2C, or change from one country to another country. And I think if we do that, we're going to have a better understanding as to what's actually driving the effects and why they're occurring. And therefore, we're going to have effects that generalize across time and space, as opposed to effects that are, maybe conditional to a point in time and space. So for example, if we think about transactional selling, or B2C selling right now, well, with everything being on social media, things have changed in that area. So maybe what was more effective 5 or 10 or 20 years ago is no longer effective today, because if you're performing unethical tactics as a salesperson, it gets shared immediately on social media. Then the other point that this leads me to is that a lot of the research that's in the premier journals right now, it's delegating context to the background, or it seeks to mitigate it as much as possible by holding it context, or by holding it constant. And I think a problem with this is that the relationships in one context don't necessarily hold to another context. And if we look at interventions specifically, their effectiveness is often shaped by the context within which the interventions performed. Right, so a change to compensation in one organization, those effects might not necessarily be the same to another. And I think we rely and draw a lot on theory to inform what it is that we're doing. But I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that we want to research generalize. And by using firm-specific samples as much as we are, there might be some issues with that. And so the last point that I want to make on this quickly is just looking at salespeople is in maybe their ability to manipulate institutions by making them more or less salient within a particular interaction. And if they're able to do that, then the effectiveness of the value proposition or what it is that they're saying may change. The fourth research opportunity, I've got 5 of them, but the 4th year is accounting for more actors involved in the selling process. So this has been pointed to by others. Plouffe et al. Had an awesome work where they found out that the relationships that salespeople had with others in their organization were more important to them, at least their performance, than were the relationships outside the organization. And what's neat about that is the relationships inside the organization tend to be pretty constant, right? So those people are there for a while. And so we can look in extending research into how it is that salespeople can better manage their relationships with colleagues in sales and other functional areas, as well as how it is that they can more appropriately manage some of those tensions that occur within sales and service, but also sales in finance, sales and engineering, and so on. And also thinking a little bit more about how it is that we can account for the contributions of other actors within buying and selling processes. So if people like in engineering or finance get integrated into a sales effort, how should their efforts be evaluated? Should they be at all, and should they be compensated for those types of things? And also whether or not we should be looking at, salespeople as managers of breakdowns that stem from failures within the organization. So should they be blaming it on those people, or should they be taking the blame? I think all of those things are really interesting. And where I want to leave off with is just introducing some ideas with respect to methodological and analytical approaches as we're moving forward. And we're moving more towards accounting for nesting in our data and also looking at change over time. But I think we can do a better job of looking at networks and the diffusion of resources, attitudes, and behaviors across networks. I think that would offer some real neat insights. Looking at nonlinear effects, we do that as well as regions of significance at times, but we could also do some with reciprocal effects. And so we can change our research designs to look at some of these reciprocal effects that might occur, and also start to begin to look at 2nd order, 3rd order, and 4th order effects. A lot of the times our dependent variables understandably sales performance, but we don't ever look at what else might be brought about by that we don't necessarily want to bring about. And so I think some of those things could be neat to integrate in the research designs. The last 2 points that I want to make, one is with respect to qualitative research. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to integrate qualitative research designs with some of the work that we're doing. I think we've had a tendency to maybe marginalize the value of qualitative work. And I think where it can really offer some rich insights is because of the fact that we don't need large organizations, or we don't need a ton of data points in order to drive out the insights. We just need to better understand what's going on within those data points. And we don't necessarily have the analytical approaches to understand the complexity at times of what's going on with the phenomenon that we want to study. I think qualitative can help get us around that. And then the last would be the experimental approaches, and not just because they're a way of driving out causality, but I think because they're a really rich way of being able to activate some of these institutions, these norms, these values and beliefs that are probably very critical to shaping how it is that buyers evaluate the value proposition of a seller. And so with that, I'll conclude. And again, I want to thank everybody for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. That was really great. We do have one question that came up. Gotfilios Nkaya has asked, how could ecosystems be applied internationally? And what are your thoughts as to sort of the global priority areas for ecosystems? I think he touches on both point 3 and point 5.
Yeah, so I mean, I think with ecosystems, you know, like when I think about systems, I think about like something that's nested. And so what I mean by that is like a system has many components, and what we choose to describe as a system, you know, it's just the level of perspective that we're taking at that time. So there's systems nested within systems. And so that ecosystem, how large it should be as terms of the scope of analysis, I think is really subject to the researcher. To me, I mean, the reality is that the data often confines us. What I think would be really neat would be tracing sort of a supply chain and looking at, you know, the salespeople and sort of looking at, you know, who it is that they're selling to and how it is that their solution is tied into other solutions that that buyer is purchasing. And so I think being able to do sort of research like that allows you to take a little bit broader of a focus. Maybe you don't cover a whole ecosystem per se as how some people might think about it, but I think the insights that you get from that would be incredibly rich. You know, I mean, that's probably a good area too in terms of emphasis.
Excellent. I know you need to go soon. I know you're not feeling well, and we appreciate you being here, but I'm going to ask one more question.
Sure.
Given your status in the field, you review a lot of manuscripts that come in the sales area. What would you say the number one thing you would share with our audiences pertaining to sort of the critical feature that you're looking at when you're looking at evaluating a paper?
I mean, if it's quantitative, it's usually like, how much do I trust these results? I mean, I think the reality is that, like most people, you know, their model is usually a model that's informed post hoc. And so they came into their research study, they ran probably 50 models, and they chose the one model that they thought had the coolest effects. And then they try to justify it. And I think it really creates a big problem, especially within the introduction, because why they've chosen to choose the moderators that they have is often poorly justified. And then when I look at the measurement properties, you know, and I don't see like really strong measurement properties too, like a lot of the times it raises big flags. So that's the big thing with quantitative work that I focus on. And then with qualitative work, it's a lot harder, or conceptual, it's a lot harder to evaluate. I really look for what's the clear like conceptual contribution, and can they spell that out? And does it appear to be an honest contribution, or is it a contribution that they're claiming to make that they're either not making because their research isn't strongly supportive of that, or it's something that somebody else has made that they're not recognizing enough.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nathan. Greatly appreciate your insights. Fabulous research opportunities shared with our audience.
Excellent.
So at this point, we're going to move on to our second presentation, which Wyatt will share his thoughts pertaining to the potential opportunities for international sales research and kind of what's going on. Wyatt, take it away.
Great. Thank you, David. And I will see if I can share screen.
There we go.
All right. Let me see one more thing. All right, just to confirm, David, at least you can see my screen. All right, perfect. Thank you, Nathan, for that. I'll start here. My name is Wyatt Schrock, Assistant Professor of Marketing at Michigan State University. Super excited and honored to be here. And I should say thank you, David. Thank you, Ahmet, for the important work that you guys are doing for CIBER, for CIBERs, for putting this together, and for seeing what I happen to believe is an important intersection between, I'll call it the international business literature and personal selling and sales management literature. I think that's an important thing to highlight. But that said, let's roll. I have 15 minutes or so. I'll do my best to cover this efficiently. Talk a little bit about the spotlighted research, particularly its motivation and aims. Secondly, I'll talk about the method or methodological approach that we took to the paper. Then I'll talk about some of our results or findings described here as topics and trends. Then I'll talk about our approach to developing a future research agenda. Let me get one thing off my screen. Okay, great. Talk about our approach to developing a future research agenda. And then I'll share maybe two or three final thoughts. So that's where I'd like to head. This is the spotlighted research that I'll focus on today. It is a 2018 paper published in Journal of Personal Selling and Sales Management. The title is on the screen. It's On the Nature of International Selling and Sales Management, a Social Network Analytic Perspective. Just published in 2018. Not too long ago in terms of years, in particular, given the topic today. I think it's still germane and kind of new. I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge my co-authors and friends. This was a team effort. I work with my good friend Jan Hoi Chow at Nebraska Omaha, Keith Richards at Baylor, Doug Hughes at University of South Florida, and Muhammad Amin at West Virginia University. So it was a team effort, and that's the result, the research that I will be discussing or putting in the spotlight. So, sorry. A decent point of departure, I think, for today's presentation is why, right? What made us interested in this? Why did we do what we did? I think two things. Number one, we don't know a lot about it, and two, it's important. So why, what made us interested? One, we don't know a lot about it, and two, we think it's important. In terms of bullet point number one, this is a quote from a paper by Artur Baldoff and Nick Lee, who's the current editor of JPSSM, from a paper in 2011, where they state, there is no uniform understanding of what international sales and sales management is all about. So we saw this as kind of a small statement in a paper that's really kind of a big statement. By the way, I'll also note here in the presentation, I'll use ISSM to refer to international selling and sales management, or international sales and sales management. So no uniform understanding. Otherwise, point two here essentially suggests that an augmented understanding of ISSM is in no way trivial. Global trade volumes continue to rise, firms large and small are continuing to look to international markets for growth. Some estimates suggest that half of US firm revenues are generated outside of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's no shortage of statistics to underscore the importance of, call it, buyer-seller exchange from a global perspective. So that's kind of underlying motivation. With that said, if some important view or some view of important phenomena is opaque or not clear or muddy, we set out to hopefully provide some incremental clarity to say, in some small way, allow us to better answer this question: what is international selling and sales management about? So this is our, call it, research purpose, big picture, provide some incremental clarity in terms of what the domain is all about. So I'll say a few words here about our, and I should have said this, what is not on this screen is that it was a review paper. So by way of a review paper, we set out to add some incremental clarity regarding what international selling and sales management is about. So in terms of method for our review, we took somewhat of a unique approach in applying or combining different approaches in sequence. We started out with text mining. We reviewed the full text of more than 130 international selling and sales management papers. Idea being, identify or extract the article's most common words or phrases. So it's, in a way, content analysis, looking to, at the end of the day, determine article topics, themes, or main ideas. We followed that with co-word analysis, where we took the keywords that were identified or extracted, and then the next step was create keyword co-occurrence matrices, where we look at pairs of keywords that occur in the same paper simultaneously. What this essentially allows us to do is get a strength of association between topics in the domain or topics in the literature. The keyword co-occurrence matrices became the input for social network analysis. So broadly and conceptually, and again, we're looking for some incremental clarity. Broadly and conceptually, we viewed the literature's topics as nodes. as nodes that constitute some system of interconnected entities, right? For example, concepts, salesperson behaviors, country, sales management activities, et cetera. We see various benefits, or at least I do, possibly biased, to using social network analysis for a review. The first of those being the ability to provide some unique view, right? Maybe even with mapping, the way in which topics within the domain are interconnected or tied together as reflected by keyword network structure and tie strength. A second benefit of using social network analysis for the review is it allows us, if we track changes in network centrality measures across time, it will allow us to get some initial insight into, call it, the evolving nature of topics within the domain or the domain more broadly. Third benefit, as we see it, and importantly maybe, of using social network analysis to review the international sales and sales management space is the ability to identify somewhat objectively keyword network disconnections or disconnected ideas, call them research gaps or structural holes, as I'll mention going forward. So that was kind of a little bit on our method. Some of the results, what does some of the output look like? This is UCINet software. You can see this just a brief, I'll stay here for maybe 30 seconds, but size of the nodes reflects closeness centrality measures, how close a variable or keyword or topic is to all others. You can see, actually Nathan pointed to this sales performance by way of foreshadowing what's on the next screen. The most prominent keyword in the domain, followed closely by buyer-seller relationships. Otherwise, in terms of tie strength, you can see a pretty strong tie between global account management and key account management, which intuitively makes sense. Otherwise, a strong tie here between Salesforce control systems and importing and exporting, which could make some sense if we think about things like uncertainty, risk, monitoring, or governance, et cetera. So this is just, yeah, that's kind of what some of the results look like. That said, what did we find? And I'm going to say topics and trends here on the slide, and I'll use the word trends with an asterisk, or at least with air quotes. We reviewed the literature from 1980 to 2017. We decided to use the change in millennium as a breaking point. The year 2000, it provided ultimately a rough split of both years and published papers. So at the end of the day, we did text mining, keyword analysis, social network analysis in 2 different time periods. And so I'll describe here some central topics and some topics of increasing centrality, what we found. First, I'll start here. Sales performance grew from pre-2000s from the networks, call it semi-periphery, to become foremost or first among the literature's central topics. We see this as not terribly surprising, and actually, based on at least one other review, we think this puts the international sales and sales management literature in line with sales literature more broadly, where sales performance is central. This is something I think Nathan actually kind of suggested in his presentation. So that's not terribly surprising. I think it actually brings the ISSM literature in line with existing sales literature more widely. Secondly, we saw increasing centrality for a variety of customer related variables. You can see here on the screen things like customer value, customer orientation, customer communication, customer interaction, et cetera. We think that this might in some way indicate increasing research or interest. I'm going to take a sip of water. Increasing research or interest in selling firms' imperative to understand diverse customer needs, oftentimes big, powerful, global customer needs. And secondly, it might indicate just the need for selling firms to adapt strategies to local market conditions, various local market conditions. Otherwise, we saw increasing centrality in various keywords related to Salesforce coordination and efficiency. I think it's a fair statement to say that with sales activities dispersed across geographic markets and cultures, that motivating, monitoring, managing generally salespeople is a significant challenge. In an efficient and coordinated way is a significant challenge for global Salesforce management. We saw increasing centrality of the developing countries keyword. Maybe not terribly surprising. Simultaneously, we saw decreasing centrality for some specific developed countries listed here on the screen. This makes a lot of sense insofar as market, from a practical sense, markets saturate and firms turn to international markets for growth, but also almost perfectly coincides with GDP growth rates in developing countries, almost in the exact same time frame that we examined. Two more, I'll just note, the sales ethics keyword grew in centrality, as did the sales technology keyword. We see these as reflecting practical realities. In the last 15 years or so, there's no shortage of sales ethics scandals in the news, just in financial services, from Countrywide to Wells Fargo. And sales technology continues to shape in ways large and small, the nature of buyer-seller interactions, the nature of salesperson activities, sales strategy more broadly. In this way, international selling and sales management we see as not being immune. So in the paper, we put forward various information like this. Much of this from like a positive or more descriptive standpoint, but our general aim was to provide some incremental clarity in terms of what personal selling and sales management is all about. So I think in terms of time, I'll try to, time will not permit a full exposition, if I can use that word, of how we developed our future research agenda, but I will do my best in the next 3 minutes or so to give you a sense of what we set out to do. And again, we're looking to try to provide some incremental clarity about the domain, but also possibly lay a groundwork for a future path forward. And I'll start here with social network analysis. I think a big benefit of using social network analysis to review the literature, in our case at least, is the ability to, if we conceptualize the domain in terms of nodes and dyads or ties, we can somewhat objectively derive disconnected ideas or network disconnections or research gaps or structural holes in the social network analysis terminology. Interesting, I'll quote Ronald Burt here, who says the following, so kind of funny to me, but actors who fill structural holes are at basically higher risk of having good ideas due to diversity of thought or alternative ways of thinking. In a similar way, and conceptually and just for fun, we kind of suggest that researchers who fill a literature's structural holes or increase their chances of making a significant literature contribution. So with that said, what are some of the structural holes that we identified? We saw a disconnection or no papers in our sample that used the global account management or key account management keywords and the sales technology keywords together. Just intuitively, it's just like, it seems to us that to be effective as a global account manager, you need to rely on, or you must rely on, or must be equipped with various technological tools, technological capabilities, for example, for managing various internal communication, monitoring promotional activities across markets, responding quickly to local needs, et cetera. Otherwise, there's lots of longstanding literature in sales that suggests that sales technology can help salespeople develop or strengthen customer relationships. And I'm thinking about work from like Gary Hunter and Bill Perrault, for example. So that's one example. Another disconnection that we saw between sales ethics and trust, and these are just some examples. There are more in the paper, but and we believe that an investigation of these two keywords together simultaneously, ethics and trust. Actually, Nathan mentioned ethics as well. Could be interesting for several reasons in an international selling and sales management context. First, there's extant literature suggesting that salespeople have different ethical perceptions across national boundaries or national culture. So what is deemed unethical in one context might be standard business practice in another. So that said, we can almost, at least in our minds, draw somewhat of a straight line between being ethical and being trusted, right? So, but if we think about, for example, I think this is a principal core to ethical leadership literature. But with that said, and making it even more interesting, there's, I think, longstanding international business literature, and I know David and Ahmet know some of this literature better than me, but that trust develops differently across cultures, generally speaking. And there's sales literature suggesting that aspects of national culture moderate the relationship between buyer trust and seller performance. So as we see it, you put all these things in a pot, and it's like, it's fruitful ground, I think, for inquiry. Yeah, so the last one I'll show as an example, we saw a disconnection between Salesforce control and the customer interaction keyword. At least two things might make this fruitful. If I can generalize the findings from these papers that look at Salesforce control in an international selling and sales management context, the results are very mixed, right? In terms of typically predicting sales performance, often varying based on sample or national culture, suggesting, and their recent scholars have pointed this out, that the effects of control systems, whether managers know it or not, vary according to national culture. So that's a thing. The second thing that might make it even more fruitful is virtually all, at least in our review, of the Salesforce control systems papers in this space are looking at seller side outcomes, typically a sales performance, not customer side outcomes, not dyadic outcomes. So we think that future international sales and sales management literature looking at control systems and customer interaction dynamics could still could be novel, important, and or interesting. So maybe a minute or two over my time, so I'll be super brief here. Three final thoughts. Our goal in this paper: incremental clarity. All right. What is international selling and sales management all about? Did we provide some incremental clarity? I hope a little bit. Is everything super clear now? Do we understand everything now? Absolutely not. So just to state that. Oh, that was that click. I should have clicked. But secondly, to classify articles as international selling and sales management articles, it had to be a sales article, and it had to collect data from multiple countries simultaneously. So a sales article that collects multiple countries simultaneously, there was precedent for that, so we did it. That said, we recognize that all literature germane to relevant to international selling does not collect data in multiple countries simultaneously. The question of what is international for encircling a domain for a review is likely complex and debatable. Last point, and somewhat related to the other, it's kind of to Nathan's point about maybe homegrown theory or just theory development. We see that there is opportunity for kind of a big foundational conceptual and theoretical work in this space that would, among other things, maybe address the aforementioned issue about kind of encircling the domain or delineating the domain. We think it's a big opportunity, and we are hopeful, and I can speak on behalf of my co-authors, that other researchers find this area interesting and keep moving the ball down the field. So that's all for me.
Excellent, Wyatt. Thank you so much for that very in-depth discussion. We do have a question that came in, and I think that this question is particularly of interest given the Journal of International Marketing has a special issue on international sales and personal selling management coming out. Well, not coming out, actually. The call date, I believe, is March of 2022. So people have time to work in this area. So the question from Ralph Park is, based on your look at the personal selling and sales management literature, do you have a sense of what percentage of sales articles or the sales literature more broadly are international in scope or take an international perspective?
Yeah, no, terrific question. We looked at that. We looked closely at the last 10 years or so of all sales papers across numerous good journals. I think we found, and it was nearly 600 papers, we found that number to be right around 6%. 6% that were classified as international in scope, collecting multiple collecting data from multiple countries simultaneously. That said, that was a sample. I'd probably feel a little bit more confident with an interval that goes somewhere like between 4 and 8%. Maybe still a small number, between 1 and 25, maybe max 1 and 12 papers. And that could be due to a whole lot of stuff too, including data collection challenges and so forth.
So a lot of opportunity available, yes?
Yes, I'd say so.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Wyatt. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. What we'll do now is we'll move on to Jess, and then we'll open up for ending Q&A. So Jessica, please take it away.
Okay, I will
As soon as
go ahead and
Wyatt's
share my
done.
screen here. Get that started. And I will go ahead and say I am at the home office and have a couple dogs. And of course, they've been quiet through the entire conversation up to this point. So I apologize if they jump in. But first of all, a big thank you for being a part of this call, being invited to be a part of this conversation today. I'm obviously, as an assistant professor, I'm a younger researcher, but somebody who, for better or worse, I'm very excited about the opportunities we have. And I think especially in this sales space and the way things are changing so quickly, we're all just working in a field that really offers such incredible opportunity that really, like I said, I'm thrilled to be here today and have the conversation. So thank you for organizing this, for bringing us on board. Two other panelists that I've worked with in the past in different capacities and doing great research. And so I'm happy to add on to that conversation today. And I joked at the start of our conversation that, the overlap that might occur and what happened, honestly, as we've gone through these last two presentations is we're certainly going to see a little bit of repetition in what I'm bringing to share today. And at first, I got the typical presentation butterflies from that, thinking, oh goodness, what am I going to share? What am I going to add? But the reality is we're all here tonight to talk about trends and to talk about where this research world is going. And so I'm actually, as we walk through those two presentations, I'm excited to build on those today. I will also say I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective on this conversation, and that is it's unique to kind of the role I have played at different universities and the role I play now at my university, and also as an area editor for JPSSM. So my role at the Journal of Personal Selling and Sales Management is research dissemination and specifically making sure that our research is disseminated in academia to push the boundaries of what we understand in sales, and also disseminated in industry to make sure that the things we're doing are making it to the forefront and we can continue to push the boundaries of sales. So with that, I'll share just a little bit. I know we shared background earlier, but I want to speak to specifically kind of the role I've played at the different universities I've been at. I did my PhD at the University of Alabama, and while I was there, worked as the research director for our sales program. So I managed kind of the student run and faculty run research projects that came in from our industry partners. I did a similar role or had a similar role at Ohio University, where I started my career and worked in the sales center there as the director for research and academics. Again, working at that interface of research meets industry. And then finally, I moved to Marquette here 3 years ago now to help them build a sales program and a sales center specifically, which we just were approved for and are official as of this semester. So yeah, exciting time to be in sales and sales and academia especially. And again, my role there has lived where my excitement for our field lives, and that is right where industry runs into the research we're doing and the impacts that it can have, not just on furthering academia, but bettering the sales profession, making firms and individuals more successful. So the lens I'm kind of taking with tonight's conversation, and I will say I want to have a discussion time for that exchange. And the view I'm taking with this is really a organic view. So I love, I think Wyatt put it best with the idea that, just like Nathan said, our goal is in sales research, we've been borrowing from so many places and we have so much ambiguity that the reality is we need some homegrown theory. We need homegrown research. And Wyatt, we're gonna have to do a paper together that uses that phrase because I love it. What I have deemed that as, and in the paper specifically that I want to share tonight, we deemed it as organic. So kind of organic processes that occur within the sales role, within the frontline role specifically, right? We see in today's world that it's not a sales role and a service role so much anymore. There's these frontline individuals that are managing and kind of at the forefront of everything the customer puts out on the table. And as Nathan said, and Wyatt also reiterated, that buying role is only growing in the number of people involved. So we see that frontline role growing in the significant demands and expectations that are being placed on it. And a lot of times we and organizations as well try to put bounds and try to push our specific agenda on what's happening in a sales role, instead of kind of sitting back and seeing where that role is taking us, where the market is really driving our sales function in today's world. So I want to talk a little bit about, the state of the front line, allude back to that JSR, which is a publication that I have with Doug Hughes as well. So Doug is making some great appearances tonight. And it was the title of that article is When Sales Become Service, the evolution of the professional selling role in an organic model of frontline ambidexterity. And that really speaks to where a lot of my research has kind of culminated in this ambidextrous balance that we play at an organizational level, at a managerial level, and at the frontline level. What that has led to is some shifting theoretical implications. And specifically, I want to talk about the international implications there. Another paper, I know Nathan alluded to it earlier for me, so I appreciate that early shout out, is a recent JPSSM that looks at creating holistic approaches to sales research. And in that, what we tried to really get across was, again, something Nathan spoke to, which is context matters. And instead of trying to take boundary conditions and make them something we have to, control for, JPSSM actually said, you know what, boundary conditions are the things that we should be exploring most. And we now have, our issues dedicated solely to that. And the international perspective isn't just a boundary condition we should kind of be tacking on to things. It's something that speaks to a need and a drive for organic homegrown research that understands what's happening there in a meaningful way. And then I'll kind of wrap up today with thoughts on what I have found successful, what I've seen others find successful for putting out timely research and publication success. And again, it boils down to organic, market-driven approaches. So kind of a theme that will ride through this presentation. So looking at that frontline role, oops, sorry about that. So implications wise, kind of the first agenda point that I shared with you all is, we've all seen and we all read that first paragraph of every sales research paper, right? We know the front line is changing. We know customers are smarter, their demands are increasing, their access to information is just compounding every time we share or interact with them. And the reality is that has led us to an organic model of consultative sales. It's led us to, in certain contexts, a sales role that lives within the buying firm. And so what that has resulted in is a lot of this intertwined sales and service expectations and increased role demands and everything that really feeds for an organization strategy. And again, going back to some of the other papers that we've discussed tonight, frontline strategy, this shift that we're seeing, it starts at the organizational level. And as Nathan's ecosystems work shows, we can't just isolate that frontline individual and think that we can understand everything that's happening without looking at the context they're operating in. And that starts with organizational strategy. There's huge implications for managing the frontline interface. We see that the demands being placed on our frontline employees, on our salespeople as they interface with the market, are growing faster than the resources being supplied to them are. And what that leaves is it's a lot of challenges for these individuals and a lot of inconsistency. And again, because we as researchers have been relying a lot on those management or psychology theories, we don't always have that complex, dynamic, networked approach we need to understand what it takes for managing successful frontline interface in a consistent and meaningful way. At the individual level, we know, again, and I know this has been reiterated quite a bit tonight, that salespeople are no longer discussing things in a one-way fashion. They're no longer just motivating or persuading. They're actually acting as kind of a flow of information, a knowledge broker that holds all of the information from inside their own organization and in that buyer's organization. And the reality is that means they live in a really complex network. And a lot of times we're explaining that away in future research directions or limitations in our paper, instead of taking the time to delve into what it actually means for them to be living on both sides of that exchange. So one graphic from that paper that I really wanted to share tonight is a look at kind of what we teased out as inorganic versus organic approaches to frontline ambidexterity specifically. So that balance of sales and service on the front line. Traditionally, organizations, and again, I think this has been our history because of this one-way flow of information that we've lived in for so long as business. Typically, we're looking at kind of an inorganic, a mechanistic kind of forced approach to responses to the market. And what that ends up being is, you know, kind of taking where we are and adding some cap on top, or adding some new role or some new feature that speaks to, in a reactive way, what the market's asking for. And the reality is that you see it doesn't create a cohesive role. It doesn't create a cohesive strategy. What it ends up being is kind of this piecemeal approach to solving a problem after we've already witnessed the problem in play. Now, again, that is a pretty good analogy that relates to kind of how we've responded to research recently as well. We see a gap in the literature, we see a call for something, and we try to respond with either the data we have, and I know we spoke to earlier, kind of forcing certain models just to see if we can add that contribution, when the reality is there's an entirely different approach, and it's an organic approach that says, you know, the market's asking for certain things, and the market has and knows what its gaps are and what its needs are. And if we as salespeople, we as researchers, then take the time to observe, to understand, to build that organic understanding of what's actually happening before we intervene, we have the opportunity to actually create more cohesive responses that align with what the market's asking for, as opposed to kind of an added approach after we've witnessed a problem. So again, that breaks down to an organizational implication, a managerial implication, a frontline implication, and those are just the three levels we have time to talk about tonight. The reality is there's meso level implications, there's buying center implications, but from this question point, we know that there's kind of two approaches we can take or organizations can take to respond to this expanding frontline role and this expanding dynamic network that occurs our front line. We can have that organizationally driven approach, which says, you know what, we'll witness what's happening in the market and kind of respond as we can. Or there's that market driven response, which we know and we're doing research on now that shows things have to happen at more of a micro level, because we can't have dynamic quick changes at the top of the organization, but we can have them in those smaller micro markets, which actually it's a pretty big trend in needs for international research. At the managerial level, we know that managers are struggling with the fact that they understand this balance is there, but the reality is the resources and the expectations still haven't quite been aligned so that employees are enabled to do these things. I mean, the fact to manage a global account without some of that technology in today's world helping us facilitate those interactions. And that's a managerial level problem. We've got to enable our salespeople to be able to capitalize on these opportunities. Finally, on that individual level, again, we know our customers' expectations are not static. Each exchange is unique. Customers are more informed than ever. Dynamic and complex demands are coming up, and that understanding and enablement has to happen at that frontline level as well. So again, speaking to kind of that second agenda point, shifting theoretical implications, kind of two big things to consider. And again, I kept this pretty high level because I want to facilitate conversation around this. We know, and all of us as we kind of go through these different pieces, that there's a balance in marketing that's always going to be tied to this idea that there's a need for revenue generation, whether that's new account acquisition, whether it's existing account expansion. Our goal and survival as a firm requires us to generate new revenue, to increase that income in the organization. The other side of that is we know customers' demands are increasing, which means those typically less tied to revenue activities are growing as well. So we're looking at a dueling approach to how we satisfy the market needs. Now, it's not any different than most industries or most contexts where we look at a trade-off that we're constantly making, right? We know our trade-off with research is the access to data versus the questions we can answer. At a very high level, we make trade-offs every day with teaching research times. We're making these trade-offs, and the reality is, again, if we step back into that organic model and see where these activities can complement and serve each other, as opposed to trying to force that dual system, the opportunities and the value that can be created from it are a very different scenario. So we know that's always going to be there, but it's going to vary across markets, industries, countries in particular. Understanding that balance in different contexts can serve our organizations, can serve our research to understand what enablement activities we need to put in place. Where can we automate? Where can we outsource certain activities in different contexts? And that varies widely with cultural norms. And that's something, again, a lot of times we have international research samples, and yet the paper isn't actually focusing on that international context, as Nathan spoke to, bringing those things to the forefront to say, this is actually a informative piece of our paper. This is actually an informative understanding. It's not something that we're just delegating to the limitations section. International boundary conditions and understanding what cultural, economic, or geographic boundaries are shifting that balance. This is a high priority item for organizations, and being able to understand and tease out when those scales tip and when we can have different pieces managed more effectively, when we can enable our salespeople with technology that help them be more successful. That's going to be a priority for research into the future. So just my last agenda item here, and again, it kind of speaks to the fact that what we're researching, a lot of times, if we take the time to actually tease it out to our level, the reality is we're dealing with very similar challenges, right? And the reality is, what I've seen in the roles I've been in, what I've seen with this manuscript I just spoke about, when questions are heavy on the minds of managers and leaders of organizations, they're meaningful to research, and taking our time to do just that. We preach to salespeople and to organizations to be market focused, to be customer oriented, to let the market drive needs. And then we as researchers typically kind of take the opposite, right? Do as we say, not as we do. And what happens is we advance our research in very small kind of leaps, or very small skips and bounds, instead of the opportunities that are there if we take the time to, again, look for that homegrown or that organic opportunity. Where and what are where are the opportunities for these values to overlap and co-create something bigger than any piece on its own. So two pieces I really wanted to talk to tonight, and this is again kind of speaking to some of my role as a reviewer, my roles with journals and some of the papers I've seen, and what kind of makes it through both on my end and both on the papers that I review for, is finding those market-derived research questions, right? Spending time with industry leaders and understanding what their biggest challenges with their sales force are, where their biggest opportunities, what do they see happening on a day-to-day basis that can inform our theories, our practice, our understanding. The reality is, the closer you work with questions that industry wants answered, the better your access to data is going to be. Organizations, when my research focuses on their biggest priority first, it's amazing the doors that open up for access to insights or even just conversations that can help you start to direct that research question. Informed narratives is something I've also seen more and more recently to drive papers through academic pipelines, and to also be those papers that see the most citations, that see the most response from academia as well as from industry. And that's those papers that are industry first, that are talking about and grounding themselves in why this matters. Nathan spoke to the challenge of an introduction that's been piecemealed together, right? The reality is, when you can capture that researcher or that individual reading your paper from the get-go with why it matters, right? And whether that's sharing qualitative insights, or whether that's sharing some model-free evidence up front that says, here's why we knew this was a problem, and here's what it means. And even I see more and more in publications, people sharing their understanding of how this would look in an organization. How would it look in a sales interaction? And that sets the stage to offer a better narrative, but also more meaningful contributions by grounding that information in what matters. So I will stop there. Like I said, I know I tried to keep it brief, but I think I still ended up being a little long. I just wanted to make sure we shared a lot of the same things tonight. I think those trends matter. And I think making sure that we're taking the time to use the context we have meaningfully, and let that context inform your research instead of the other way around.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was amazing. Absolutely wonderful. We do have a lot of questions that have come up. People send them directly to me, so I'm going to spatter them around to the three of you, if you don't mind. So since you just finished, I'm going to start with you, Jessica. Question pertains to frontline interface. You had noted a boundary of culture as potentially influencing the balance of revenue and customer service. How do you view that in the broader sense of issues related to sustainability, climate change, and the well-being of the salesperson in the international context?
So that's where I think, again, we have a lot of opportunity to use context to make meaningful narratives. That is going to change at a cultural level, absolutely, but also at a micro level with the industry you're in, the customer expectations in that industry. And what it kind of boils down to is the opportunity to strategically take a lot of different approaches. I mean, in some spaces, it makes sense and it's better for my employees' well-being to have a separate service unit and a separate sales unit. In some places, it makes a lot more sense and it makes a lot more, it supports the well-being of my employees a lot more, and it's much more sustainable to combine those roles into one interaction with the customer, right? And a lot of that is driven by the customer. Does my customer want and expect to have separate interactions? Or is this a sale that they're looking for and they expect to have their one key account manager be their go-to for everything? And that's where I can't emphasize enough. I think letting the context drive that research question and the framing around it has a huge impact on how impactful the results can be.
Excellent, excellent. So the next one I think goes to both Nathan and Jess, and then I'll go to Wyatt we have two of them for Wyatt. So I'm going to ask both Jess and Nathan to address this issue, and I'm going to ask Nathan to go first, but only kind of address the portion you feel most comfortable with. The reason it's asked to both of you is you both highlighted organic theory and or qualitative research as being these wonderful opportunities. But these approaches are particularly problematic in the review process. So the question asks, could you speak to tips to be successful with these approaches rather than doing them and having your papers rejected? Nathan, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess like rejection is sort of the default, right? So it's almost, unfortunately, the decision that's most likely. But that's the case, I think, regardless of what approach you use to a paper. I think the challenge too with conceptual and qualitative is that there is more subjectivity to it, and I think as a result, it can become easier for authors to not take accountability for their own shortcomings. Like I think with empirical, it's easier in some ways to, at least with more quantitative, to look at a study and see what's its flaws before it's submitted. And it's easier to evaluate, in my opinion, as a reviewer. But I think that can lead authors to conclude that maybe their study is making a more important contribution or it's more novel than it really is when it comes to conceptual and qualitative. In terms of trying to set oneself up, I think it's really important with conceptual and qualitative to try to make it very clear what research body you're contributing to, because that's going to ultimately inform who's selected as your reviewers. And there's an example of this, like I do a lot of work in the service dominant logic space. And there's a lot of people that have very strong views in support and in opposition of that. And if we get a review team that, is just not open to service dominant logic, it doesn't matter what the manuscript says or how novel it is or how much time we spend into it, the probability of it getting rejected is very, very high. And so what we really try to do again is in that first paragraph, clearly define who is going to be our target audience. In a big part of that is not just the writing that we use, but it's who we choose to cite, because that informs the editor's decisions too. And then I think we try to make a strong case in our submission to point out appropriate reviewers. And we never would identify people that are not appropriate reviewers, but I think trying to convey to an editor again who's going to be a good fit to evaluate manuscript and why makes a convincing case to put the manuscript in those people's hands.
Excellent. Jess?
Yeah, those are all great points. I really enjoyed that, Nathan. I would say, so one kind of, again, a little bit of a different perspective on the answer to that question is, I will say for myself, especially, I know the qualitative research, it's absolutely, it creates some challenges with reviewers. It's something where you have to have that narrative nailed down about why it matters, to who it matters. But I will say for me, qualitative is, again, from an organic mindset, it's the first step. I've only got one paper that's fully qualitative that's published. Most of my other work, the qualitative study either informs and becomes kind of the pieces of that narrative in the start, and it informs. And what I've noticed is reviewers are usually pretty open if you have a qualitative study that's done well to a sample that's, if you can't get into an organization and an MTurk or something like that, sometimes reviewers are going to be a little bit more open to that when you have that to tack on and support what you're bringing up in that qualitative research. But typically I'm using that qualitative approach to understand myself, to go into an organization and start asking the questions and dig down to what they're trying to fix. But it's more of the narrative that starts the conversation. And again, I joked earlier about the first paragraph of every research paper talking about how volatile the market is and dynamic customers are. And the reality is that that's absolutely true. But a lot of times we kind of mail in those first 3 to 5 paragraphs of a manuscript as, you know, the standard template that you just kind of fill in. Just in, again, the template, but in a way that says, here's who this research is for, here's why it's going to make an impact, and here's what story we're trying to tell. And that qualitative research, it guides your next steps when you do that quantitative work, so you have a better chance of it being successful. And it sets up that introduction so that you are not, you know, playing that game Nathan spoke to earlier, where you're trying to find a way to fit the things that work together. You're instead saying, here's the contribution we're making, and here's why it's going to advance the sales literature and why it's going to advance the way we sell in the world today.
Excellent, thank you. Wyatt, a question pertaining, I think, to your method, SNA. And the question is, how might SNA be used on publicly available sales material to gain insights into the sales process? I'll be honest, that's over my head. So I'm hoping you know what they're talking about.
I'm just writing that publicly available sales materials.
So the
And
SNA methodology, I guess?
yes.
Maybe to draw themes from the materials?
Yeah. Give me about 10 seconds to think on this. And this is just instinct, and I'd love to have this conversation one-on-one. But yes, it's instinct. If it's possible to categorize steps in the sales process. I heard sales process, so I'm thinking like, you know, everything from prospecting on the front end to the back end service stuff, you know, the post-sale service stuff that Jess has mentioned. If it's possible to categorize or organize those activities, standardize them in some way. I don't know. It's possible to conceptualize those activities as nodes. Exactly where you would go from there, I'm not exactly sure. But I'd be interested in having that conversation. That person can definitely reach out to me personally.
Excellent. So potentially a research opportunity.
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent.
Yeah, and we could, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question I'm going to direct to Nathan, and this question is, it goes back to the organic research issue, and the question is, and I think Ahmet will have a position on this as well, to be honest with you. Innovative research is often rejected because of the argument that it has been done before. So given the lengthy history of the sales literature, how much of what we're examining is new versus old?
I mean, I think that if we think about not just sales, but we think like anything, it could be medicine, it could be psychology, it could be sociology. I mean, we're ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, in any period of time, sort of examining what people have examined before. Maybe there's unique nuances and twists to it, but I think probably, you know, 95% of it, maybe technology introduces some new novel things. But I think that what's really valuable about these theoretical and maybe innovative approaches is reframing in getting people to think about what they've thought about for 80 years in a different way. And that to me is where the most insightful and important contributions come from. Is it, you know, it's like like I think like combinatorics, like if you think about math and there's probably millions and trillions of different ways to put the parts together to form a whole. And we all have that ability to move the pieces around to tell a different story. And so what story makes the most sense? And what does that story get us to think about differently than how we thought about things before? And I think that's where the opportunity with the research is.
Excellent, excellent, thank you. Jessica, the question came in, you seem to have had a very diverse set of experiences at different universities, which gave you the opportunity to truly engage with sales professionals. For those of us who are not at schools with sales centers, what advice can you give to us for expanding our network connections with salespeople so we can better investigate sales topics?
Sure. So I will say, and I think we've all kind of felt this crunch recently. It has a lot of new demands on our jobs. It's taken a lot of our resources away in certain cases. So what we have found ourselves, kind of the situation we found ourselves in, is a lot of universities are looking to faculty to find new ways to reinvigorate curriculum, bring in sources of industry engagement. Academia is changing in the sense of the teaching world, right? A lot of universities are looking more for their students to be able to get industry interactions, and whether that's just guest speakers or whether that's down to having a sales center and doing things like sales competitions and interacting with companies that way. I would argue, or I would kind of say my experience has been that even when I'm not working in the sales center capacity, that organizations, they value a PhD, and they value, especially if you're answering research questions, sales research questions in today's world, because organizations are just as kind of lost as we are, and they're looking for people that have the methodological capability, that have the background to understand and provide something that they don't have. And so what I would say is one, from a university standpoint, instead of looking at some of these new challenges that are being thrust upon us as challenges, looking at them as opportunities to say, you know what, again, I love the field we're in, because not many disciplines can I interact with industry, help them, get data from them that feeds my research, that then I can turn right around and put into the classroom. And so when you look at those three roles, instead of looking at them as, hey, I'm going to trade off on all these things, because that would be our inorganic approach, right? Instead of saying, hey, I'm going to give 20%, 40%, 40%, look at them and say, where do they complement each other? Where can I have, invite a company in to talk to my class, because even if it's virtual, they want to do that just so that they can get access to your students. And then all of a sudden you have a little bit of that relationship and leverage to say, hey, let's grab a cup of coffee and talk about what your biggest challenge is, right? What is the sales managers keeping you up at night right now? Honestly, kind of taking that sales process we talk so much about and putting it into practice to talk to organizations about just those things. And whether it ends up leading to true access to great data, or it just ends up being a conversation, that conversation gets filed away, and you have another and another, and all of a sudden you start to see trends across them that feed a really cool research idea. And I will say the papers that I have that came from a research question that industry brought me have, knock on wood, so far all been published. The ones that I have tried to force a research question have had much dicier roads trying to get published. So starting the conversation, and like I said, even if 4 times out of 5 it's just a 20-minute conversation, you're still building up insights that can lead to something pretty great.
Excellent, thank you. So we have about 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask one more question. This is going to go to Wyatt. Wyatt, you had mentioned some topics of increasing interest. What topics did you find of reduced interest in the literature?
Some that come to mind, less focus on recruiting, selection, hiring, less focus on sales training, which is actually kind of interesting. This is what somewhat interestingly, given that there is sales research showing that training differences, there are training differences across cultural boundaries. A big one, reduce centrality for several variables related to salesperson well-being. Actually, I think I heard Jess mention salesperson well-being. Interestingly, this is we stopped in 2017. Obviously, this is pre-COVID, but I think that there's fruitful, it's a fruitful area to think about salesperson well-being and job stress now, especially in an international sales context, based on some actual qualitative interviews I had an opportunity to do. The last one I'll mention that comes to mind, but I still think it's a fascinating topic, is that we saw reduced interest in cross-cultural negotiations, in cross-cultural sales negotiations. So, but I think that's still super interesting, super important. But I think those opportunities are still out there.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to close. Ahmet and I will have a few words. I'd like to say first, personally, thank you all for your just absolutely phenomenal insights. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today. I wish to thank all the participants for sharing their evening, morning, or night with us. Some are 2 in the morning. I'd also like to give a big shout out to Katie Lane, my boss at the TAMU Cyber, as well as Monica and Rhonda at MSU, Monica at TAMU. So I just want to say thank you all. Ahmet, would you like some closing remarks?
Sure, thank you. I'd like to thank you first. This is a great experience, and I have to tell you that we've been having a lot of fun on all these various topics. We started with the editors, and then we went on with the cultural distance, and now the international sales. So touching on those different interesting topics, and I really enjoyed this discussion. My knowledge is very limited on the sales issues. Although I personally think that, based on my personal experience, and Jess was talking about talking with the managers, I wasn't a salesperson, but worked very closely with salespeople in my previous life. And I think these cross-cultural encounters matter a lot in sales interactions. And I'm having conversations with Wyatt and others about how can we, work together on something that would be really interesting from a sales perspective, from an IB/sales perspective. So this was very informative. I've learned a lot from this webinar, and thank you for the useful insights and tips on opportunities in international sales research. I'd like to thank also our participants, attendees, who asked very interesting questions, and we're looking forward to see you in another event on sales or our own research spotlights on different topics. Thank you very much for joining us to have this great discussion tonight, and this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are.
Thank you all. Much appreciated.
Thank you.